Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
The Silent Alibi. Chapter 1. The Dead Man's Secret. The tranquil evening air of Cabot Cove was filled with the soft chirping of crickets, the waves lapping gently against the shore, and the faint rustling of the trees. It was the kind of evening that promised nothing more than a peaceful night. But Jessica Fletcher, sitting in her cozy living room, pen in hand and a cup of tea at her side, had learned long ago to expect the unexpected. As she jotted down a few notes for her latest novel, the shrill ring of the telephone broke the calm. "Fletcher," she answered, placing the pen down and adjusting her glasses. It was always strange when the phone rang at this time of night, especially with the quiet that usually surrounded her home. "Jessica, it's Sheriff Tupper," came the voice on the other end. "I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but we've got a situation here. It's Thomas Richardson." "Thomas Richardson?" Jessica repeated, frowning slightly as she thought of the reclusive millionaire who owned the grand estate on the cliffs. "What's happened?" "It's murder, Jessica. We found him in his library. He's dead, and there's no sign of forced entry or struggle. It's like someone wanted him dead, but made sure no one saw anything." Jessica set her teacup down with a soft clink. "I'll be right over, Sheriff." Within minutes, she had grabbed her coat and made her way to the Richardson estate, a grand manor perched on the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the darkened ocean. The house stood as it always did, imposing and magnificent, its windows darkened, as though the estate itself had drawn the curtains to shut out the night. But tonight, something was amiss. Sheriff Tupper was standing by the front door, his face drawn with worry. He nodded curtly as Jessica approached. "Thanks for coming, Jessica. You've always been a help with these kinds of things." Jessica offered a sympathetic smile. "Let's see what we're dealing with, Sheriff." They walked through the grand front hall of the mansion, its old oak floors creaking underfoot, as they made their way toward the library. Tupper led her through the darkened corridors where the only light came from the flickering glow of candles in sconces. It was a grand place, but it had always had a cold, detached air to it. Thomas Richardson had been a private man, and the mansion reflected that. When they arrived in the library, Jessica's eyes immediately fell on the body of Thomas Richardson slumped in a high-backed chair near the grand fireplace. His face was pale, his eyes wide open in shock. A half-empty glass of scotch sat on the small table beside him, a cigarette resting in the ashtray. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire, but the stillness only deepened the mystery. There was an eerie calm about it all, as though the room itself had been holding its breath. Jessica knelt beside the body, her trained eyes scanning the room for clues. The faint scent of tobacco lingered in the air, mixing with the musty smell of old leather and wood. She examined the body carefully, but there were no visible signs of trauma. No blood, no wounds, no obvious cause of death. "Did he drink much?" she asked quietly, turning toward Tupper. "Not really," the sheriff responded. "Thomas wasn't much of a drinker, but his nephew, Ian, says he had a glass of scotch almost every night. Never more than one." Jessica looked at the glass. It was half full, and something about the liquid inside seemed off. It didn't quite look like just alcohol. She picked it up and examined it more closely. The amber liquid reflected the dim light of the fireplace, but it also had an odd sheen to it. The faintest trace of something unusual caught her eye. She turned toward Tupper. "What do you know about Ian?" "Ian Richardson, Thomas's nephew, is the one who found him," Tupper explained. Ian had planned to meet his uncle for dinner tonight, but when he arrived, the door was locked. He said he tried calling Thomas's phone, but there was no answer. When he finally got inside, he found Thomas in that chair. "Has Ian said anything about why he was here tonight?" Jessica asked, her mind already beginning to piece together possibilities. Tupper shrugged. "He didn't seem to know anything was wrong. He said he just came by for their usual dinner. But there's something about Ian that doesn't sit right with me." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The sheriff sighed. "Ian's been in town for about a year after living in Boston. He's been staying here at the estate, but no one really knows much about him. He's distant, a bit of a mystery." Jessica's eyes narrowed. The story was already beginning to form in her mind, but it was still missing too many pieces. "Was the door locked when Ian arrived?" she asked, changing the subject. "Yes, it was locked from the inside," Tupper replied, "and there was no sign of forced entry. The windows were shut tight and everything was just as it should be." "A locked room mystery," Jessica mused. "How convenient." She rose from the chair and walked toward the bookshelves that lined the far wall of the library. She ran her fingers over the spines of the books, noting that they were arranged in meticulous order. The room appeared untouched, like no one had been here in the hours leading up to the discovery of Thomas's body. "Was anyone else in the house when Ian arrived?" Jessica asked. "No," Tupper said. "The staff was all off for the night. Thomas had kept a pretty tight-knit crew, but he never entertained much. No guests tonight, at least as far as we know." "Have the staff been questioned?" "Not yet. I thought I should wait for you." Jessica turned back to Tupper. "I'll need to speak with Ian and the staff. I'll also need to see the autopsy report as soon as it's available. We need to figure out how Thomas died, and if this was anything other than an accident, we need to find out who was behind it." Tupper nodded. "I'll get started on that, Jessica, but as I said, this is complicated. It doesn't feel right. It feels calculated." "I agree," Jessica said, her mind already racing through the details. "And we haven't even scratched the surface yet?" As Jessica and Tupper left the library, the weight of the mystery settled on Jessica's shoulders. Something was off about Thomas Richardson's death. A locked room, a mysterious nephew, and that strange glass of scotch. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay hidden in the most unexpected places. It was time to start digging, and Jessica Fletcher always found what others missed. Chapter 2. The Silent Alibi. The following morning, Jessica returned to the Richardson estate, her mind still buzzing with unanswered questions. The mystery of Thomas Richardson's death weighed heavily on her, and with each passing hour, more details seemed to stir in her thoughts. Sheriff Tupper had promised to gather the staff and bring Ian to the estate for questioning, but Jessica knew that in cases like these, the truth often lay hidden in the smallest of details. As she arrived at the mansion, the morning fog had begun to lift, revealing the sprawling property. The estate, once grand and imposing, now appeared even more foreboding under the cold, grey sky. It stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the town she had grown to love. But Jessica wasn't here to admire the view. She had a job to do. Inside, she was greeted by the sheriff, who seemed no less troubled than the night before. His face was tight with frustration. "Morning, Jessica," he said, leading her to the small dining room where the staff had gathered. "I've got the staff here. Ian's on his way." Jessica nodded but couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The staff, who had worked under Thomas for years, were mostly silent, looking around nervously. No one seemed to meet her eye for long. She addressed the group, her voice calm but assertive. "Thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but I need your cooperation. You were all here last night, correct? Can anyone tell me if you noticed anything unusual?" A woman who appeared to be in her late 50s, her hair pulled into a tight bun, was the first to speak. "I didn't hear anything, Miss Fletcher. I was in my quarters, like usual. The house was quiet." "Quiet is good," Jessica replied with a small nod. "But it's important we find out if anyone saw or heard anything. Even the smallest detail could help us." The woman seemed to relax, but another member of the staff, a younger man with dark hair and an anxious expression, quickly chimed in. "I noticed the lights in the library were on well after Mr. Richardson's usual bedtime, but that's all." "Thank you, that's helpful," Jessica said, writing a note in her notebook. She turned her attention to a man standing at the back of the room, his posture stiff, eyes darting toward the floor. "And you?" she asked, her tone gentle yet probing. The man, who appeared to be in his early 40s, cleared his throat before speaking. "I was in the kitchen all night. I didn't hear anything unusual, and no one came by." Jessica made a mental note of the staff's responses. No one had anything concrete to add, which was troubling. She needed to get to the heart of the matter. With a polite nod, she excused herself and turned to Sheriff Tupper, who was standing by the door. "Well, Sheriff," Jessica said, her brow furrowed. "We've learned little from them, but I think we need to talk to Ian now." The sheriff gave a stiff nod. "He's waiting in the study. I've had him sit down, but he's a bit jittery, I'd say." As Jessica entered the study, she was met with the sight of Ian Richardson, a man in his mid-30s with dark, messy hair and sharp features that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He stood by the window staring out at the estate's grounds, his posture rigid. "Mr. Richardson," Jessica began, her voice soft but firm, "I'm sorry for your loss. I know this must be difficult." Ian turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he replied curtly. "But I'm not here to discuss my feelings. I just want to know what's going to happen to my uncle's estate." Jessica studied him carefully, noting his aloofness and the nervous twitch in his hands. "I understand, but for now I need to ask you some questions. You were the one who found your uncle's body, correct?" Ian nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. "Yeah, I came to the house for dinner, but the door was locked. I called him, but there was no answer. When I finally got in, I found him in the chair, dead." "Was your uncle expecting you?" Jessica asked, leaning forward slightly. Ian hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, we had dinner plans. It wasn't the first time." "Was there anything unusual about his behavior recently?" Jessica pressed. "Anything at all that seemed out of the ordinary?" Ian shifted uncomfortably. "No, nothing. My uncle was, well, he was a bit of a recluse. But he was always polite, businesslike. He didn't have a lot of visitors except for a few close associates." Jessica's mind raced as she processed his words. A recluse. Businesslike. Not much different from what she had already learned about Thomas Richardson from the staff. But Ian's reaction was troubling. His coldness didn't match the typical grief someone would show at the loss of a family member. She had to dig deeper. "Tell me about your relationship with your uncle," Jessica asked, her gaze fixed on Ian's. "How did you get along?" Ian's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Jessica thought he might refuse to answer. But after a pause, he spoke, his voice low. We didn't exactly get along, but we didn't fight either. I was just trying to make something of myself. I had to move back here when things didn't work out in Boston. My uncle didn't approve of my choices, but we didn't argue about it. Jessica absorbed his words. It sounded like there was more to the story, but Ian wasn't ready to share it just yet. She decided to shift the focus of her questioning. Do you have any idea who would want to harm your uncle? She asked gently. Ian seemed to flinch at the question, his eyes darting away. He shook his head. No, he didn't have any enemies, at least not that I know of. Jessica studied him, her instincts telling her that Ian was hiding something. But for now, she let the silence linger, knowing that sometimes people revealed more in their quiet moments than in any interview. All right, Mr. Richardson, Jessica said, standing up. Thank you for your time. I'll need to speak with some of your uncle's associates. If you think of anything else, anything at all, please let me know. Ian nodded stiffly, but didn't say another word as Jessica turned to leave the room. Sheriff Tupper followed her out, his face still filled with concern. I don't like the way Ian's acting, Tupper said quietly. But it doesn't make sense. He's got no obvious motive, does he? Jessica shook her head. Not yet. But I have a feeling we're only scratching the surface. Ian might not be the killer, but he knows more than he's letting on. The mystery of Thomas Richardson's death was far from over. In fact, Jessica felt in her gut that the hardest part was just beginning, and with every step, the puzzle was becoming more and more intricate, a tangled web of secrets, lies, and hidden motives, and Jessica was determined to uncover it all. Chapter 3. The Unseen Visitor. The Richardson estate seemed even more oppressive in the daylight, its towering walls and sprawling gardens casting long shadows across the meticulously kept grounds. Jessica stood outside the mansion, taking in the full scope of the place. It was a place of wealth, of old money, and of secrets carefully tucked behind grand doors. But Thomas Richardson's death had cracked those doors open, and Jessica knew the answers were somewhere within. Sheriff Tupper met her outside as she made her way toward the front door. His face was furrowed in thought, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. "Good morning, Jessica," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking about Ian. Something about him doesn't sit right with me." Jessica nodded, her eyes scanning the grand entrance. "I agree, but we still don't have enough to pin anything on him. If we're going to crack this case, we need more information." Tupper grunted in agreement. "I've got a list of business associates that Thomas dealt with. I was hoping you could take a look through his things and see if anything stands out." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "A list of associates? That might be useful. But I'm more interested in finding out what, or who, was missing from the picture. If Ian was involved, he had help. Someone to help him get into that locked room." "You think it was an inside job?" Tupper asked, surprised. Jessica didn't reply immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked up at the house again. "I'm not sure, but I feel like there's someone we haven't thought about yet. Someone who knew exactly how to get in without leaving a trace." Tupper looked skeptical. "So you think someone else was involved? Maybe a hired hand?" "It's possible," Jessica said slowly. "But we'll have to dig deeper into Thomas's past to find out who might have had both the means and the motive." As they entered the mansion, the atmosphere inside seemed heavier than ever. The grand staircase, which spiraled upwards toward a second floor that overlooked the main hall, was still bathed in early morning light. It should have been beautiful, but instead it felt cold and impersonal. They walked past the study where Ian had been waiting the night before, the room still as orderly as it had been when Jessica last saw it. but now the walls seemed to close in, as though the house itself were hiding something. It was in that moment, as Jessica turned the corner into the hallway, that something caught her eye. A shadow. It was fleeting, barely perceptible, but it made her pause. She stopped mid-step and turned back to look down the hallway, her senses sharpening. There, at the far end of the hall, a door had just creaked open, but when she took a step toward it, it slammed shut again. "Did you see that?" Jessica whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Tupper, who had been walking beside her, looked down the hallway, his eyes narrowing. "No, I didn't see anything." Jessica's instincts were on high alert now. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously down the hallway, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpeting. As they reached the door, Jessica reached out and turned the handle. The door opened with a quiet click, revealing a small, dimly lit room. It looked like a storage closet. Nothing unusual, except for the faint scent of something strange in the air. The room was neat, but what caught Jessica's attention was a small table in the corner, cluttered with various papers, pens and books. A single sheet of paper was half hidden under a pile of old documents. She bent down and pulled it out carefully. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, and then she froze. "What is it?" Tupper asked, stepping closer. "It's a note," Jessica replied, her voice tight. "A note addressed to Thomas." She held it up for Tupper to see. The handwriting was elegant, precise, but there was a certain coldness to it. The message was short and direct. "You cannot hide your past forever. It will catch up to you, and when it does, I will be waiting." Jessica felt a chill run through her. The message was cryptic, but the tone was unmistakable. A threat. But who would threaten Thomas Richardson? And why would it be hidden in a forgotten corner of his estate? Tupper took the note from her hands and studied it for a moment. Could this be a warning from someone he was in business with? Possibly, Jessica said, her mind racing, but whoever wrote this had to have known him very well. This wasn't a random threat. She folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. "We need to find out who sent this. This person might hold the key to understanding why Thomas died." Just as they were about to leave the room, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Jessica turned to find Ian Richardson standing in the doorway, his face pale but determined. "I thought I'd find you here," he said, his voice strained. "Is something wrong?" Jessica straightened up, her eyes locking with his. "We found something, Ian. Something you should see." Ian's eyes darted to the paper in Jessica's hand and then back to her face. "What is it?" "A note," Jessica replied, her gaze steady. "A note addressed to your uncle. It seems he was being threatened by someone." Ian took a step back, his face unreadable. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly, his voice shaky. "I swear, I had nothing to do with it." Jessica studied him closely. She didn't believe him. There was something off about his reaction, something that didn't quite add up. "Do you know who might have written this?" she asked, her voice calm but insistent. Ian shook his head. "No, I didn't know anyone who would threaten him like that. My uncle didn't have enemies. He kept to himself." Jessica could tell that Ian was hiding something, but she needed more than just his denial. The situation was becoming more complex by the minute. First, the mysterious locked room. Now, a threatening note from an unknown source. Whoever was behind this was playing a careful game, and they were using all the right moves to keep Jessica and the sheriff on their toes. "All right, Ian," Jessica said finally, slipping the note back into her pocket. "We'll need to talk to more of your uncle's associates. Maybe someone out there knows something about this threat. But until then, stay close." Ian nodded. though his eyes betrayed him. He knew more than he was letting on. Jessica could feel it, and she was determined to find out exactly what that was. As they left the room, Jessica's mind was already turning over the possibilities. She had only scratched the surface, and she knew that the deeper she dug, the more dangerous the situation would become. But one thing was certain. Thomas Richardson's death was far from a simple crime of passion. There was more to this, and Jessica Fletcher was going to uncover every dark secret it held. Chapter 4. A Web of Lies. The investigation into Thomas Richardson's death had already taken on a life of its own. What had initially appeared to be an unfortunate accident, a quiet, solitary death in a locked room, had quickly spiraled into a much larger mystery. As Jessica sat in her study later that afternoon, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to be multiplying, not shrinking. There was so much more to Thomas's life, and Jessica had the distinct feeling that the more she uncovered, the more danger she might be walking into. The strange note they had found earlier, the one threatening Thomas about his past, was now sitting on her desk under a magnifying glass. She ran her finger over the elegant but ominous handwriting, each word feeling like a puzzle in itself. Who would want to expose Thomas's past? She muttered aloud, her eyes still scanning the note. It was a question that had consumed her since she first read the message. A threat so personal could only have come from someone who knew Thomas intimately. But no one in Cabot Cove had mentioned any long-standing enemies or any dark secrets about Thomas. The sound of a car pulling into her driveway interrupted her thoughts, and Jessica glanced out the window. It was Sheriff Tupper, his vehicle pulling up with a sense of urgency that didn't go unnoticed. She rose from her chair and met him at the door as he entered. "Afternoon, Jessica," he said, his voice grim. "I've got some new information. It's not good." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Tupper handed her a manila envelope. "I've been in touch with Thomas Richardson's lawyer. We got a copy of his will." Jessica took the envelope and opened it, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. As she began to read, her eyebrows furrowed. "His will?" she repeated. "Why does this matter?" "Because of who he left everything to," Tupper said, his voice low. "It wasn't Ian. In fact, Ian wasn't mentioned at all." Jessica looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Tupper leaned against the doorframe. "Thomas had a clause in his will that stated his entire estate would go to a charity, a foundation that helps children in need. But that's not all. The rest of his assets, his financial investments, properties, were left to someone named Evelyn Moore." Jessica's mind began to race. "Evelyn Moore? Do you know who she is?" Tupper nodded. "That's the kicker. Evelyn Moore was one of Thomas's old business partners. They worked together years ago in real estate, but she disappeared without a trace about 5 years ago. No one's heard from her since." Jessica stood in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle starting to form in her mind. A woman with a mysterious past, an ex-business partner of Thomas's, someone who had completely disappeared. And yet her name had surfaced in the will, a woman who would inherit everything Thomas had worked for, leaving Ian completely out in the cold. "Did Ian know about this?" Jessica asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Tupper shook his head. "He claims he had no idea, but from what I've gathered, Evelyn Moore wasn't even in Cabot Cove when Thomas passed. Her whereabouts are still unknown." Jessica's mind worked quickly. Evelyn Moore had been out of the picture for years, but now her name resurfaced in such a significant way. The question was, why had Thomas chosen her over his own nephew? Why leave his legacy to someone who had seemingly vanished from his life? Tupper continued, We also found something else while going through Thomas's papers. A letter, dated just 2 weeks ago. It's clear that Thomas had been in contact with Evelyn, but the contents of the letter are strange. What do you mean, strange? Jessica asked, intrigued. It talks about a meeting they were supposed to have, Tupper said. Thomas mentioned something about settling old debts, clearing the air. But the letter never specifies what the debts were about. Jessica's mind began to connect the dots. A mysterious woman from Thomas's past, a hidden inheritance, and now a letter that hinted at unresolved business between them. She turned the letter over, scanning it once again for any clue she might have missed. The letter was brief, with no return address, and signed only with the name E. "I need to speak with Ian again," Jessica said, her voice firm. "He knows more than he's letting on, I'm sure of it." "I'm not sure he's going to cooperate anymore, Jessica," Tupper replied. "He's already been through questioning, but with this new information about the will—" "Ian might be angry, but he's still hiding something," Jessica interrupted, already making her way toward the door. "If this was about money or an old grudge, he might know more about Evelyn Moore than he's saying. I need to talk to him again." Tupper sighed, but nodded. "All right, I'll arrange another meeting, but I have a feeling this is only going to get messier." Later that afternoon, Jessica was once again standing in front of Ian Richardson. The young man's demeanor had changed since their last meeting. He was no longer aloof or reserved. Now he seemed nervous, almost agitated. His hands trembled as he fidgeted with a glass of water on the table in front of him. "Ian," Jessica began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to be honest with me. I've learned about your uncle's will, and I have to ask, did you know about Evelyn Moore?" Ian's eyes flickered with something. Guilt? Fear? It was hard to say. "Evelyn Moore?" he repeated, his voice trembling. "No, I don't know her. Not really." Jessica leaned in closer. "But you must have heard his name before, Ian. She was important to him, wasn't she?" "I don't know anything about her," Ian said quickly, his tone defensive. "Thomas kept his business dealings to himself. He never mentioned her to me. You've got to believe me." Jessica studied him carefully, her instincts telling her that Ian was lying. "What about the debts Thomas mentioned in that letter? Did you know anything about that?" Ian's face paled. He looked away for a moment, then straightened up in his chair. "No, I swear, he never told me anything. I didn't even know he was still in contact with her." Jessica could tell Ian was hiding something, but the question was what? Why was he so desperate to distance himself from Evelyn Moore and his uncle's business dealings? "Ian," Jessica said, her voice steady, "I'm going to find out what happened to Evelyn Moore, and I'm going to find out what Thomas was really hiding. If you're not telling me the truth, this is only going to make things worse for you." Ian's jaw clenched. "I'm telling you everything I know." His voice broke as he stood up abruptly. "I didn't kill him. I don't know what happened, but I didn't do it." Jessica rose from her chair, studying him closely. She had reached a dead end with Ian for now, but something about his behavior was telling her that the truth wasn't far off. There was a deeper connection between Evelyn Moore, Thomas Richardson, and Ian, and Jessica Fletcher would be the one to unravel it. As she left the room, her mind buzzed with the questions she still had unanswered. One thing was clear. The investigation into Thomas's death had just taken a darker turn. Chapter 5. The Secrets in the Shadows. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation. Jessica had delved deeper into Thomas Richardson's life, but the more she uncovered, the murkier things became. The once peaceful and quiet town of Cabot Cove was now a place of secrets, lies, and hidden motives. Jessica knew that someone or something was pulling strings from behind the scenes, but who and why? The sheriff had made some progress on his end. He had reached out to a few more of Thomas's old business associates, but so far none of them seemed to know anything about Evelyn Moore or the debts mentioned in the mysterious letter. All Jessica could do was keep digging, hoping that the next piece of the puzzle would bring clarity. It was late one evening when Jessica received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was familiar, though she hadn't heard it in years. "Jessica," the voice said, smooth and measured. "It's been a while, hasn't it?" "Elliot," Jessica replied, a sense of recognition flooding back. "What do you want?" Elliot Greenway was an old acquaintance, a private investigator who had worked with Jessica on a few past cases. He was sharp, resourceful, and had connections that Jessica couldn't always tap into. But the last time they spoke, their paths had diverged, and Jessica hadn't expected to hear from him again. "I hear you're involved in the Richardson case," Elliot continued, his tone casual. "I've got some information that might help." Jessica's curiosity piqued. "Go on." "There's more to Evelyn Moore than you think," Elliot said. "I've been looking into her for a while now. She was involved in some very questionable dealings before she disappeared. I've got files that could give you some much-needed answers." Jessica's pulse quickened. "What kind of dealings?" "I can't go into the details over the phone, but trust me, she's not as innocent as everyone thinks," Elliot replied. "I'll send you the files. Meet me at my office tomorrow. We'll talk then." Jessica hung up the phone, her mind swirling. Evelyn Moore had clearly been a pivotal figure in Thomas's past, someone who had been far more than just a quiet business partner. But Jessica needed proof, something concrete to tie everything together. The next morning, Jessica made her way to Elliot's office, a small but tidy building tucked away in a quiet corner of the town. When she entered, Elliot was already waiting for her, seated behind his desk. He had a file folder open in front of him, and his sharp eyes met hers with a knowing look. "Here," he said, handing her the folder. "This should fill in some of the gaps for you." Jessica flipped through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the contents. The documents were filled with details about Evelyn Moore's past, including her business dealings with Thomas Richardson. But there was more. Much more. The file revealed that Evelyn had been involved in a number of shady real estate deals, ones that were highly questionable in nature, often bordering on illegal. There were reports of underhanded tactics, manipulated contracts, and shady connections to organized crime syndicates in Boston. "She was connected to a lot of bad people," Jessica said quietly, her finger tracing over the documents. Elliot nodded. "That's putting it lightly. She had a reputation for getting what she wanted, no matter the cost. And then, about 5 years ago, she disappeared. No one knew where she went, but according to my sources, she was being chased by some very dangerous people." Jessica closed the folder and looked up at Elliot. "So you think Thomas was involved with people like that? Was he a victim? Or was he complicit in her dealings?" Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "It's hard to say. Thomas was always the kind of man who kept his cards close to his chest. But from what I've gathered, he and Evelyn had a falling out, and that's when she disappeared. The timing is suspicious, especially when you consider her sudden reappearance in his will." Jessica's mind was racing. Evelyn Moore hadn't just been a quiet business partner. She had been involved in something far darker, something that could have made Thomas a target. But what about Ian? Was he involved? Had Thomas's nephew known about Evelyn's past and the dangerous people she was connected to? Jessica's thoughts were interrupted as Elliot spoke again. "There's something else," he said, his voice low. "I got a lead on her whereabouts. I have an address for her, but it's out of state. I can't go there, but I thought you should know." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. This was the break she'd been waiting for. "Give me the address." Elliot hesitated for a moment, then scribbled the address down on a piece of paper. "If you go there, Jessica, be careful. I'm not sure what you're walking into, but I can tell you one thing. Evelyn Moore is not the woman you think she is." Jessica took the address and tucked it into her pocket, her resolve hardening. She had a destination now, a name that could unravel the entire mystery. But she also knew that the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. "Thank you, Elliot," she said, her voice steady. "I'll take it from here." As she left his office, the weight of the case seemed to settle even more heavily on her shoulders. The deeper she dug, the darker the truth became. Evelyn Moore had been hiding something, and now Jessica was about to confront it head-on. The next few hours were a blur of preparations. Jessica packed a small bag, gathered the documents she had on the case, and made arrangements to leave Cabot Cove. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. If Evelyn Moore was the key to solving this case, then Jessica was going to find her, no matter what it took. By nightfall, Jessica was on the road, heading toward the address Elliot had given her. The drive was long and quiet, the darkened landscape flashing past her window. As the hours ticked by, Jessica's thoughts turned to the family she had left behind in Cabot Cove. Ian, the nervous nephew. Sheriff Tupper, who had been kind but increasingly frustrated. And of course, Thomas Richardson, whose life and death had set all of this in motion. But now it was time to uncover the truth about Evelyn Moore. And she wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. Chapter 6. The Long Road to Truth. The road stretched on before Jessica, winding through the dense woods and sparsely populated towns. As the miles ticked by, her mind returned again and again to Evelyn Moore, the woman whose name had surfaced as the key to unraveling the mystery of Thomas Richardson's death. But there was more to Evelyn than just a business partner gone rogue. The documents in Elliot's file had painted a picture of a woman deeply entangled in criminal activities, someone whose life had been a tangled web of shady deals and dangerous alliances. Jessica wasn't sure what she would find when she reached her destination, but she was certain of one thing: it was going to change everything. The small, unassuming town she reached late in the evening felt far removed from the bustling streets of Cabot Cove. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of a sign swinging in the wind. Jessica checked her map one last time before pulling into a parking lot across from a run-down motel. The address from Elliot's file had led her here, to the edge of a town that looked as though it had been frozen in time. As she stepped out of her car, the chilly air wrapped around her, making her shiver slightly. She took a deep breath and walked towards the motel's office. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and a lone figure sat behind the desk, hunched over a crossword puzzle. The clerk didn't look up as Jessica entered. "I'm looking for someone," Jessica said, her voice steady but firm. "Evelyn Moore." The clerk didn't seem startled by the question, but he paused for a moment before speaking. "You'll want to check room 12, he said, his voice low and almost disinterested. "She's been staying there for the past few days." Jessica nodded and reached for her purse. "Thank you." Room 12 was tucked in the far corner of the motel, and the door was slightly ajar. The faint scent of stale cigarettes and coffee lingered in the air as Jessica approached. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob for a moment, and then she pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, with only a single lamp casting a soft glow on the small space. The first thing Jessica noticed was the clutter. papers scattered across the bed, an empty whiskey bottle on the nightstand, and a few pieces of clothing tossed carelessly on the floor. The room felt lived in, but it was clear that Evelyn wasn't trying to make herself comfortable here. "Ms. Moore?" Jessica called softly, stepping further into the room. Her voice echoed slightly in the small space, but there was no answer. Jessica's eyes scanned the room, her gaze lingering on a set of papers spread out on the bed. She walked over to them and carefully picked one up. The documents were business contracts, financial records, and real estate deals, all seemingly linked to the shadowy enterprises Jessica had already uncovered. But then something caught her eye. A letter, written in the same elegant handwriting as the note found in Thomas's library. Jessica unfolded it carefully. The letter was brief, but it carried the same cryptic message that had haunted her since the beginning of this investigation. "The past is never truly gone, Thomas. We both know that. I've waited long enough. It's time to settle our old debts, once and for all. I'll be ready when you are." Her fingers trembled as she read the words. This was it. The confirmation that Thomas had been involved in something far darker than anyone had realized. But what was the debt Evelyn was referring to? And what had it cost Thomas? Jessica turned back toward the bed, her eyes scanning the room one more time. She noticed a small, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a pile of papers. She grabbed it and flipped it open, the pages filled with entries in the same careful script. The entries weren't particularly revealing at first glance, but as Jessica read further, she realized they were notes about Evelyn's life over the last several years. And there, in the last few pages, were references to Thomas Richardson. The tone had shifted from businesslike to personal, and it was clear that Evelyn had been deeply affected by their falling out. The final entry was the most telling. "I should have never trusted you, Thomas, but I'm done playing games. I'll take what's mine, and when I do, you'll finally understand why I left. This isn't over." Jessica's heart raced as she read the last words. Evelyn had been planning something for a long time. But what? And how did it all connect to Thomas's death? Just then, the sound of a door creaking open startled Jessica. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway was a woman who appeared to be in her mid-40s, with sharp features and dark, piercing eyes. She was dressed in a loose, oversized jacket and looked every bit the part of someone who had been hiding out for years. "Looking for me, Jessica?" the woman asked, her voice low and steady. Jessica didn't flinch, though the sudden confrontation made her instincts sharpen. "Evelyn Moore," she said, her voice calm but filled with authority. "I need to ask you some questions." Evelyn's lips curled into a tight smile. "I'm sure you do, but the thing is, I'm not sure I'm ready to answer them just yet." Jessica didn't back down. "You're involved in something much larger than yourself, Evelyn, and it's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Evelyn stepped further into the room, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I doubt you understand anything about the truth, Jessica. You're just like everyone else, trying to fit pieces together without knowing the full story." "I'm getting there," Jessica replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I know enough to understand that Thomas Richardson's death wasn't just an accident, and I know that you're hiding something." Evelyn's smile faded, and for a moment there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Then she shrugged. "Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but I've got no more time to waste on this. You'll figure it out soon enough, but don't expect me to make it easy for you." Before Jessica could respond, Evelyn turned and walked toward the door. "You should go, Jessica, before things get even more complicated." Jessica stood still for a moment, watching Evelyn's retreating figure. There was something about her, something dangerous, yet calculated. Jessica knew Evelyn Moore was no ordinary businesswoman. She had ties to a world that most people could never understand, and Thomas's death was just the tip of the iceberg. As Evelyn closed the door behind her, Jessica felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. She had come this far, but the answers she sought were still just out of reach. Evelyn Moore was playing a game, and Jessica was determined to figure out the rules before it was too late. Chapter 7. The Face of Deception. The morning after her confrontation with Evelyn Moore, Jessica woke early, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her. The quiet, eerie motel room felt even more oppressive in the daylight. She had learned a great deal in the past few days, but the pieces still didn't fit together. Evelyn Moore's cryptic messages, the mysterious debts, and the revelations about Thomas Richardson's past had only raised more questions. Jessica had confronted Evelyn face to face, but the answers she sought were still elusive. After a quick breakfast, Jessica packed her things and left the motel. The town of Beechwood, though small and unremarkable on the surface, seemed to hold an endless number of secrets just beneath its quiet exterior. Jessica knew that if she wanted to find the truth, she had to dig deeper, and she had a feeling that the answers wouldn't come easily. She headed to the local sheriff's office to meet with the sheriff, hoping that any new developments might shed some light on Evelyn's past. As she walked in, Sheriff Nolan looked up from his desk, his face tense. "Jessica," he greeted, his voice strained. "I've got news. Not the kind of news you want to hear, though." Jessica sat down across from him. Her curiosity piqued. "What's happened?" Nolan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk as he spoke in a low voice. "We've got a lead on Evelyn Moore, a solid one. She's been in contact with a man named Vincent DeMarco. Ever heard of him?" Jessica's stomach tightened. The name was unfamiliar, but it sent an uneasy shiver down her spine. "No." "Should I have?" Nolan grimaced. DeMarco's a big player in the real estate business, or should I say, the underground real estate business. He's been tied to organized crime, extortion, and money laundering. Last year we had some solid evidence pointing toward him, but he managed to slip through our fingers. Jessica's mind raced. "And Evelyn was involved with him?" "She's more than involved," Nolan replied grimly. "From what we've gathered, she's been working with DeMarco for years, handling some of his more unsavory transactions. There's even talk that she was planning to move some of his dirty money through the very real estate deals she had with Thomas." Jessica leaned back in her chair, trying to absorb the new information. So, Evelyn wasn't just some innocent partner in business. She was involved in criminal activities. But why come back to Thomas after all these years? What does she want now? "That's what we don't know," Nolan said, rubbing his forehead. "But I'm sure of one thing. This goes beyond just money or business. There's something personal between her and Thomas, something she wants to settle." Jessica's instincts were in overdrive now. She couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn's return to Thomas's life had been calculated. She wasn't just after money or revenge. There was something deeper at play, but the pieces still didn't fit. "I'm going to need to speak to DeMarco," Jessica said, her tone firm. "Do you have any leads on where I can find him?" Nolan hesitated before answering. "DeMarco's always moving around, but we've got one place we know he frequents, a bar on the outskirts of town called the Rusty Anchor. It's a dive, but it's one of his regular spots. You might find something there." Jessica nodded, grateful for the lead. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll check it out." The Rusty Anchor was a stark contrast to the quiet, picturesque town of Beechwood. It was tucked away down a winding road, surrounded by overgrown trees, and from the outside, it looked like a relic from another time. Faded neon lights flickering above the door. Jessica stood outside for a moment, collecting her thoughts. If Evelyn Moore was really connected to DeMarco, then this dive bar might hold the key to unraveling the last of the mystery. Inside, the low murmur of conversation stopped as soon as Jessica stepped through the door. The patrons, mostly older men nursing beers, glanced up but quickly went back to their drinks. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke, and the dim lighting gave the place a grimy, unsettling feel. Jessica approached the bar, where the bartender, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, looked up at her. "I'm looking for Vincent DeMarco," Jessica said, her voice steady but assertive. "Is he here?" The bartender's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't look surprised. "I don't know who you're talking about," he replied, his voice flat. "Never heard of him?" Jessica leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "Don't lie to me. I know he's here, and I know you've seen him. I'm not here to make trouble, but I need information. It's important." For a long moment, the bartender stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded toward the far end of the bar, where a man sat alone in a corner booth, nursing a drink. "There he is," the bartender muttered. "But you didn't hear it from me." Jessica's pulse quickened. This was it. She walked toward the booth, her heart racing. The man sitting there was older than she had imagined, with graying hair and sharp features that gave him a calculating look. He wore a dark suit, a stark contrast to the worn-down surroundings of the bar. There was an air of authority about him, one that suggested he was used to people being afraid of him. She slid into the booth across from him, her gaze unwavering. The man didn't acknowledge her at first, but when he finally looked up, there was a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. "You're Jessica Fletcher," he said, his voice smooth but edged with suspicion. "The writer." "That's right," Jessica replied, her voice calm. "And you're Vincent DeMarco." DeMarco's lips curled into a sly smile. "I thought I told you to stay out of this." "You're in over your head, Jessica. This isn't your kind of case." "I don't think I have much of a choice," Jessica said. "Thomas Richardson's death is part of something much bigger than I originally thought. And I think you know exactly what that is." DeMarco leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the glass. "I'm sure you do," he said, his eyes narrowing. "But the real question is, are you prepared for the truth?" Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She had finally cornered him, and now the truth was just within reach. But as she met DeMarco's gaze, she realized that she had only scratched the surface of what was really going on. Whatever this man knew, it would change everything. Chapter 8. The Final Revelation. The atmosphere in the Rusty Anchor felt like a pressure cooker as Jessica sat across from Vincent DeMarco, each moment stretching into eternity. DeMarco's icy gaze bore into her, the weight of years spent in the shadows of crime and deceit hanging over him. But Jessica wasn't intimidated. She had come too far, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. "You know more than you're letting on, DeMarco," Jessica said, her voice steady. "I've been digging into Thomas Richardson's death, and it's clear that you're involved. But the question is, how far does this go?" DeMarco chuckled softly, a dark sound that sent a chill through the air. "You're a clever woman, Jessica. I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth. This isn't just about Thomas. This is bigger than any one person." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Bigger than Thomas? What does that mean? How does Evelyn Moore fit into this?" At the mention of Evelyn's name, DeMarco's expression flickered for a brief moment. Jessica caught it, the slightest twitch in his lips, a crack in his facade. It was enough to know that Evelyn Moore was the key to everything. "You want the whole story, huh?" DeMarco leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. "All right, here it is. Thomas Richardson wasn't just some reclusive businessman. He was involved in something much darker than anyone realized. Jessica's mind raced as she listened intently. Go on. DeMarco took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly before continuing. Evelyn and Thomas were once partners in a major real estate empire, but their business wasn't exactly clean. They used their properties as fronts for laundering money, dealing in shady investments, and doing favors for the wrong people. But Thomas, he got too greedy. He started playing both sides, taking on clients that even I wouldn't touch. Jessica absorbed every word, her heart pounding. So, you're saying Thomas was mixed up with criminals? And Evelyn had to know about it? DeMarco nodded. Evelyn was in deep. She knew everything about the deals Thomas was making, but when things went south, she vanished. She cut ties and disappeared, but not for long. The debts, the money laundering, it all caught up with Thomas. And when Evelyn found out he was planning to double-cross her, she came back to settle things. But why kill him? Jessica asked, her mind turning. Why murder Thomas? If he was involved in this dirty business, why not just take everything and walk away? DeMarco's eyes glinted with a mixture of respect and disdain. Thomas wasn't just any partner. He was a coward. He thought he could get away with everything, the crimes, the deceit, everything. But Evelyn wasn't having it. She came back to collect, but she wasn't going to just take his money. No, she wanted him to pay for what he'd done to her. To them. Jessica's stomach tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. So Evelyn didn't just want the money, she wanted revenge. Exactly, DeMarco replied with a sinister smile. And Thomas, being the fool he was, didn't take her seriously. He thought he could hide behind his wealth, his status. But in the end, that wasn't enough. Evelyn had already planned everything. She knew exactly what to do to make sure he paid, and make sure his death would send a message. Jessica processed his words, her thoughts running a mile a minute. But how does this all tie back to Ian, Thomas's nephew? He had nothing to do with any of this, did he? DeMarco's eyes softened, just for a second. Ian, he's an innocent bystander in all of this, but he's also a pawn. Evelyn used him just like she used Thomas. She needed someone close to the family to make her plan seem credible, but Ian's got no idea what's really going on. He's just a part of the story that's already been written. Jessica stood up, taking a slow, deliberate step back from the table. So Evelyn set the whole thing up. She orchestrated Thomas's death, knowing that it would look like an accident, a robbery gone wrong. But it was never about money, it was about power and revenge. DeMarco's smile faded, and he leaned back in his seat, the weight of his silence telling her everything she needed to know. You've got it, Jessica. But you've also got to understand something. This game, the one Evelyn's playing, it doesn't end with Thomas. She's still out there. She's got her eyes on something much bigger. What do you mean? Jessica asked, her pulse quickening. You think she's finished? Think again. She's been setting things in motion for years. Her plans aren't just about money or revenge. They're about control. She's looking for something that could change everything for everyone. Jessica's head spun. What could be bigger than this? What's she after? DeMarco's gaze shifted toward the window, and for a moment Jessica wondered if he would answer. Finally, he spoke in a low, deliberate voice. She's after the real estate empire, the power, the leverage that comes with it. But what she really wants is the secret that Thomas was hiding, the one he never wanted anyone to know. And that secret? It's worth more than money. It's worth everything. Jessica felt her breath catch in her throat. The secret, the one that had haunted Thomas, the one that Evelyn would stop at nothing to uncover. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about something far bigger. I need to find Evelyn, Jessica said, her voice sharp. and I need to find out what Thomas was hiding." DeMarco's eyes gleamed. "You'll never find her in time, Jessica. She's already one step ahead. She always was." "Then I'll find a way," Jessica replied, her resolve hardening. "Because the truth has to come out, and I won't let Evelyn get away with what she's done." As she turned to leave, DeMarco's voice followed her. "Be careful, Jessica. The truth is a dangerous thing, and sometimes it's better left buried." But Jessica wasn't listening anymore. The final revelation had been made, and now the chase was on. She wasn't about to let Evelyn Moore win, not when there was still a chance to uncover the last piece of the puzzle. The truth was waiting, and Jessica Fletcher would stop at nothing to uncover it.